When the courtroom doors eased open, the atmosphere changed so quickly, it felt like a shift in air pressure. A routine morning, steady, predictable, almost quiet enough to hear papers settling, suddenly tilted. Judge Caprio had just finished speaking with an older woman about a late fee. A man in his 70s waited next, holding his hat with both hands. Nothing suggested the day would be memorable. And then the clerk called the next case. Case number 4821, Ethan and Evan Halden. A small ripple went through the room. People exchanged looks, not curiosity but recognition. The Halden name carried the weight of headlines and whispered conversations about developments that had carved new silhouettes into Providence's skyline. Two young men stepped in, identical in their movements, yet mismatched in their attention. The first twirled a set of keys, metal clicking against his palm with a casual rhythm that didn't belong in a courtroom. The second typed on his phone without slowing, his gaze glued to the screen, as if summoned there by gravity. Their clothing was expensive, though worn as carelessly as gym gear. Their posture spoke of people accustomed to being noticed, never questioned. The room tightened around them. Older spectators straightened. Someone muttered, "Those are Galen Halden's boys." The name alone filled the silence with an unspoken contrast. Years of civic disputes, negotiations, lawsuits, and now his sons, strolling in as if this were another boardroom they didn't intend to respect. Judge Caprio nodded to the clerk. She read the charges with her usual clarity. Speeding in a residential zone, aggressive parking in a disabled-only space, straightforward violations on paper. But the brothers responded with a tone that shifted the air yet again. "Let's keep this quick, Judge," the one with the keys said. "We'll just pay it," the other added, without lifting his eyes. "Not worth dragging out." Their indifference landed like a pebble dropped in still water, small but sending wide ripples. Several heads turned. A man in the second row let out a short, stunned breath. Even the clerk paused long enough for the faint sound of her keyboard to stop. Judge Caprio continued reading, then mentioned the street of the incident. The same street where, only a week earlier, an elderly woman had been struck by a car. His tone didn't harden, but something deliberate entered it, an undercurrent of responsibility. The brothers didn't catch it. One of them laughed softly when the fine was stated, a careless, private sound. Not malicious, just detached, like someone reacting to an inconvenience at a valet stand. That was when a voice rose from the back row, unplanned, worn with age. "You don't understand what it's like when a neighborhood stops feeling safe," the older man said, half standing, his hand gripping the pew. The room settled into a heavy silence. For a moment. The brothers' confidence hovered without footing, and Judge Caprio's gaze shifted. Not anger, not judgment, but a quiet registration. Something in this case was larger than a speeding ticket, and everyone felt it, even if the brothers did not. The morning no longer felt routine, and the weight in the room was no longer paperwork. It was expectation. Judge Caprio leaned forward slightly, inviting the brothers to explain the circumstances themselves. His expression remained even, but the request carried a quiet insistence. "Speak for yourselves." Evan responded first. He straightened his shoulders, as if preparing for a presentation. "We run several businesses," he said. "We're constantly in motion. Those signs in that area, they're not always clear." His voice held the sort of confidence built over years of being told he was exceptional. Ethan added, tapping the edge of the defendant's table with restless fingers. "This whole thing is overblown. It's a parking spot. We didn't hurt anyone." There was no edge of anger, just boredom, as if he'd been pulled out of a meeting he didn't want to attend. Their words settled over the room with a weight neither of them noticed. People listened the way one listens to someone speaking from a world entirely unlike their own. The judge didn't challenge their tone. Instead, he asked about their background, Nothing invasive, just enough to let them speak further. They answered casually, and in those fragments, a picture formed. Their father's company had just prevailed in a long zoning dispute with the city. Their family operated under the assumption that obstacles were negotiable and rules were adjustable. Not stated outright, but visible in every shrug, every dismissive phrase. Caprio flipped through the case file. "It appears there were prior warnings," he said quietly. "A notice was sent 3 months ago. Neither of you appeared." Ethan smirked. "We had our attorney handle that. Isn't that what representation is for?" The remark drew a soft groan from someone in the gallery. A woman in her 60s shook her head, lips pressed thin. The older audience recognized the attitude instantly. Youth cushioned by resources, mistaking convenience for immunity. The judge didn't react outwardly. "I see. And the second citation that day? Parking in a reserved space?" Evan exhaled, trying to sound reasonable. "Look, the area was packed. We were late for a meeting. We figured it wouldn't matter for a couple minutes." But Caprio lifted a page from the file, and something changed. "Cameras show 2 vehicles associated with you, both parked in violation, on the same afternoon." His tone remained calm, though it landed with precision. A faint shift went through the brothers' posture. Evan's confident stance tightened. Ethan's foot stopped its tapping for the first time. The judge continued, reading carefully. "It wasn't one isolated mistake. It was a pattern over several hours." The gallery stirred. A few people exchanged looks of incredulity. This was no misunderstanding, but a deliberate disregard. Evan swallowed hard, just once. It was nearly imperceptible, yet enough to reveal a crack in the image he'd been holding. Ethan shifted his weight, suddenly attentive in a way he hadn't been since entering the room. It wasn't fear. Not yet. But it was the dawning sense that someone here wasn't impressed. Someone who didn't bend, didn't rush, didn't respond to entitlement with flattery. Judge Caprio set the file down with a quiet finality. The moment carried no anger, just clarity. And clarity in that silent room felt sharper than reprimand. The brothers exchanged a quick glance, unrehearsed, uneasy. Their confidence, once synchronized, no longer aligned. The judge let a measured silence settle before asking a question that sharpened every gaze in the room. "Which one of you was driving that evening?" His tone was neutral, but it carried the weight of a stone dropped into still water. The brothers froze, not dramatically, but in a way that revealed how tightly their routine answers had been rehearsed. For the first time, they didn't immediately echo each other. Evan inhaled, preparing to speak. Ethan cut his glance toward him, waiting. Neither moved beyond that small hesitation. Caprio nodded to the clerk. She handed him a printed sheet, stills from traffic cameras. He positioned it where both young men could see. The images showed 2 luxury cars entering the same block within minutes of each other. In one frame, the Porsche eased into a restricted zone. In another, the Tesla lingered beside the curb before easing into a disabled designated space. The timestamps were uncomfortably close, but the detail that caught the room's attention was this. The drivers appeared to switch vehicles between stops. The implication wasn't spoken, yet everyone sensed it. An attempt to muddy responsibility. Evan's throat tightened. It wasn't supposed to be confusing, he murmured, barely audible. That trace of vulnerability sent a palpable shift through the gallery. It wasn't guilt. It was the first admission that things were not as harmless as the brothers had tried to present. Ethan bristled. "Why are we dissecting this? No one was harmed." His voice rose not in anger, but in frustration born of losing control. A voice from the benches responded, steady but edged with hurt. The older man from earlier stood fully this time. Someone was hurt, he said. My neighbor tripped near that same curb because a car was jammed halfway into the walkway. She hasn't been steady on her feet since. The brothers stared at him as if he'd spoken in a language they'd never heard. Their certainty, once impermeable, faltered. Judge Caprio's expression changed, just slightly, enough to signal that this wasn't merely about broken rules anymore. Consequences don't disappear just because we choose not to see them, he said, not raising his voice, yet sending a tremor of truth across the room. Ethan's jaw tensed. Evan shifted back a step, leaning on the edge of the table, as if its solid surface were suddenly necessary. The judge continued, his gaze steady. This isn't about misunderstandings. It's about decisions. And what concerns me is how willingly those decisions were repeated. Spectators leaned forward. The air held a rare mixture: disappointment, impatience, a flicker of hope that accountability was finally catching up. The brothers no longer mirrored each other. Evan's confidence looked frayed at the edges, while Ethan's defiance felt hollow, like a performance held long past its effectiveness. Neither spoke. The silence they offered was different from any before, no longer dismissive, but uncertain. In that stillness, the case shifted from procedure to revelation. The courtroom wasn't waiting for punishment. It was waiting to see whether the truth would finally cut through the armor they'd worn their whole lives. The judge reviewed the papers the clerk had brought, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in focused assessment. The courtroom remained still, sensing that something more substantial was coming. When he finally spoke, his tone was quiet, almost reflective. We've received clarification on the ownership of the vehicles involved. He turned a page. The Porsche belongs to both of you, but the Tesla, the one that occupied the reserved space, is registered to your father's company, and there's a temporary disability permit attached to it. A low murmur swept across the gallery. Several older spectators exchanged glances, recognizing what that meant long before the brothers reacted. Evan blinked. That tag is just administrative. Our dad sorts out those details. His voice trembled slightly, as though rehearsed explanations were failing him for the first time. Ethan stepped forward, shoulders tight. I didn't handle that. He told me to use it if parking was impossible. He said it quickly, as if confessing before he fully understood what he was admitting. The judge paused, letting their words settle, not to shame them, but to give the room space to absorb the implications. Misuse of a permit wasn't a minor lapse. It symbolized a deliberate choice to stand above accommodations meant for people struggling with mobility, people who had earned every inch of that relief. Caprio folded his hands. Was your father aware you were using that tag? His question was simple, but it peeled away every layer of avoidance. Evan's expression dropped into something rawer than nerves. It wasn't meant for us, he whispered. It belonged to our grandmother. He hesitated, voice thinning. She passed almost 2 years ago. The silence that followed was deeper than any previous pause, not accusatory, just stunned. The realization moved through the room slowly, heavy as winter air. Older attendees looked down, not out of judgment, but out of a familiar sadness that comes from watching reverence replaced by convenience. Ethan's jaw slackened. It was unclear whether he was shocked by his brother's admission or by hearing the truth spoken aloud for the first time. The judge's face remained composed, but his next words landed with deliberate precision. A permit exists to protect someone who cannot move freely. Using one after its rightful holder has passed is not a clerical issue. It is a choice. He leaned in slightly. And it tells me something important about how you view responsibility. The brothers didn't interrupt. Their earlier bravado evaporated, replaced with a kind of stunned stillness that made them look far younger than they had upon arrival. Caprio's final question held no sharpness, only a profound disappointment that struck deeper than anger ever could. When was the last time either of you made a decision with someone else's burden in mind? The words hung in the air, touching places neither brother seemed equipped to defend. Ethan shifted his gaze to the floor. Evan's shoulders sagged, the weight of 2 years' silence finally settling on him. In that moment, the courtroom no longer saw two untouchable heirs. It saw two young men confronting a reality they had spent years insulating themselves from. One truth at a time. Judge Caprio let the room breathe for a moment before speaking again. His voice softened, not out of sympathy, but out of intention. Measured, careful, aimed straight at the conscience rather than the ego. Your grandmother, he began, likely needed that permit for reasons neither of you cared to inherit. It meant struggle, limitation, courage, and her name was used not to honor her, but to cut corners. He didn't raise his tone, yet every word carried the weight of someone who had seen too many shortcuts end in regret. The brother stood rigid, as if movement might expose even more. Evan's jaw trembled with the effort of maintaining composure. Ethan's arms were crossed tightly, though his fingers betrayed a faint shake. You keep insisting time is precious, the judge continued. Then answer this. Why was hers less valuable than yours? The question struck with a quiet force. No outrage, no theatrics, just a mirror held steady. Evan's eyes flickered, and something inside him broke loose. I'm tired, he blurted out. I'm tired of covering for him, for everyone's expectations, for decisions I didn't make. The confession came out unevenly, as though it had been waiting years for an exit. Ethan snapped his gaze toward him, startled. Covering for me? He shot back, but the anger wasn't real. It was fear, wearing a louder mask. Their exchange didn't escalate. It dissolved. Years of practiced unity thinned into something fragile, almost childlike. I knew today would fall apart, Ethan said, not defensively but with a defeated honesty. I didn't want to be here. I just didn't want all of this exposed. The judge studied them quietly, then reached for a remote on his bench. A screen flickered on, an additional camera angle the court hadn't yet discussed. The footage showed a narrow crosswalk near the parking space. A frail woman approached, steadying herself with a carved wooden cane. A car waited behind her, Evans, its engine rumbling impatiently. He gestured through the windshield, urging her to move faster. The room reacted with a soft gasp. Not outrage, disappointment. A weariness older viewers knew too well. The sight of youth forgetting gentleness. Evan shut his eyes. The image of himself on the screen seemed to drain the air from his chest. Judge Caprio turned off the screen with a subtle click. There's more at stake here than fines, he said. Money won't teach what this moment requires. He paused, choosing his next words with precision. You will each complete 40 hours of service at the city's senior center. You will speak with people who have lived long enough to understand the value of patience, respect, and humility. And you will write a reflection afterward, not for me, but for yourselves. The decision wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It carried the kind of authority that comes not from power, but from wisdom earned over decades. Gasps were replaced by thoughtful stillness. Some attendees nodded. Others looked away, moved in ways they couldn't voice. Then the judge added, gently but firmly, if it helps, I'll drive you there myself today. So the lesson starts before you forget what this morning felt like. The offer wasn't sarcastic. It was an invitation to transformation, the rare kind. For the first time since entering the courtroom, neither brother had anything to say. Their silence wasn't defiant anymore. It was the beginning of understanding. The courtroom felt strangely calm after the judge's ruling. No burst of relief, no rumble of protest. Just a quiet recognition that something meaningful had taken place. The clerk gathered her papers. Spectators shifted in their seats with the solemn attentiveness of people witnessing a turning point, not a punishment. Judge Caprio addressed the brothers one last time. His tone was steady, stripped of reprimand, closer to the voice one uses when giving advice that might matter decades later. "Your grandmother must have been a remarkable woman," he said. "People like her teach us how to move through this world with dignity. It would serve you well to reclaim the part of her that doesn't show up on permits or paperwork." The words weren't sharp, yet they bypassed every defense the brothers still clung to. Evan's shoulders sank in a gesture that resembled gratitude more than defeat. Ethan stared at the floor with the uneasy awareness of someone hearing truth unsoftened for the first time. Before anyone could stand, a figure rose from the third row, a woman in her late 70s, slight in stature, leaning on a polished cane. Until that moment, she had blended into the bench, unnoticed. She approached slowly, her steps measured. "I was in that crosswalk," she murmured, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Don't waste the years you have by walking past people who can't move as quickly as you." Her presence was disarming. No anger, no scolding, just the patient resolve of someone who had survived much harder things than rudeness. Ethan swallowed hard, unable to fully meet her gaze. Evan nodded once, almost tremulously, as if imprinting her face into a place he didn't know existed inside him. She returned to her seat without waiting for a response. She didn't need one. As the hearing concluded, the brothers gathered their belongings. No whispered strategy, no synchronized movements. Only a quiet, unfamiliar caution between them. When they reached the exit, something subtle happened. Ethan stepped aside and held the door open for his brother. A small gesture, nearly invisible, yet it carried more meaning than their earlier bravado. The judge watched them go. When the latch clicked shut, he exhaled a single reflective breath and spoke softly into the now emptier room. "Some learn through penalties," he said. "Some through fear, and some through finally seeing who they've become." He didn't say it to the clerk or to the gallery. It was spoken to the stillness itself, a final note settling into the wood-paneled walls. The spectators filed out slowly, many pausing to glance at the bench with the quiet gratitude older generations feel when justice comes without cruelty. No applause, no murmured congratulations. Just respectful silence. Outside the courtroom, the brothers walked a few paces apart, their earlier swagger replaced by an unsteady calm. No one could tell whether the shift would last, but the morning had carved something into them. An imprint made not by fines or threats, but by truth presented plainly and without malice. And though the story ended at the courthouse doors, its echo trailed behind them like a long shadow. The realization that accountability, once faced, has a way of lingering long after the room has emptied.